October 14, 1943. 27,000 feet above northern Germany. The sky should have been empty. Instead, it was alive. A deep mechanical roar rolled across the upper atmosphere. Low at first, almost like distant thunder. Then, louder. Louder still. Soon the sound became something else entirely, a constant metallic storm echoing through the clouds. From the ground near the city of Schweinfurt, a young German anti-aircraft gunner named Gefreiter Karl Weber shaded his eyes and looked up. At first he saw nothing, just the pale autumn sky. Then tiny flashes appeared high above, small, glittering points of light moving in perfect rows. For a moment Weber thought they were reflections from ice crystals in the atmosphere. But the lights kept growing and growing. Within minutes, the entire horizon seemed to fill with silver shapes. Bombers. Hundreds of them. Maybe more. Karl Weber had seen Allied aircraft before. Every German soldier had. But never like this. Never in numbers that seemed to swallow the sky itself. Above him, American B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators stretched across miles of sky in tight geometric formations. Their polished aluminum bodies reflected the morning sun so brightly that from the ground they looked like a moving wall of light. One formation passed overhead, then another, then another. The roar became unbearable. 4 engines per bomber, multiplied by hundreds of aircraft. The vibration rattled windows in nearby farmhouses. Birds scattered from forests. Even the heavy concrete bunkers of the anti-aircraft batteries seemed to tremble. Karl Weber felt something strange in his chest. Not fear. Something deeper. Disbelief. Because this wasn't a raid. This was an armada. Far above him, inside AB-17 named Royal Flush, Lieutenant Robert "Red" Morgan gripped the controls while the aircraft bucked in the thin air. The temperature outside was nearly minus 50 degrees Celsius. Ice formed instantly on exposed metal. The bomber's 4 Wright Cyclone engines thundered steadily as Morgan held formation, with dozens of other bombers flying wingtip to wingtip. The formation stretched for miles. To his left and right, the sky was filled with aircraft. Rows of B-17s stacked in tight combat boxes, each plane positioned so its machine guns overlapped with every other aircraft. This wasn't just a bombing run. It was a flying fortress of fortresses. Morgan glanced out the cockpit window. The sight still stunned him. Endless bombers, endless contrails, endless engines. Even after months of missions over Europe, the scale of it was difficult to comprehend. Behind him, the bombardier called out over the intercom. Still 40 minutes to target. Morgan nodded silently. Below them waited Schweinfurt, the industrial heart of Germany's ball bearing production. A target American planners believed could cripple the German war machine. But getting there would not be easy. Every German fighter within range was already climbing, and every anti-aircraft gun in the Reich was about to open fire. Back on the ground, Karl Weber heard the first distant boom. Then another. Within seconds, the entire horizon exploded with black smoke. German flak batteries, 88mm guns, the same deadly weapons used against tanks, began firing thousands of shells into the sky. Each explosion created a black puff of smoke at bomber altitude. Hundreds of them. Soon the sky above Germany looked like a storm made of ink. The bombers kept coming. They flew straight through it. From the ground it looked impossible. Every burst of flak should have destroyed them. But the formations held. More bombers appeared behind the first wave. And more behind them. Karl Weber slowly lowered his binoculars. His commanding officer muttered something quietly beside him. Mein Gott. My God. Because what they were witnessing was something Germany had never seen before. An industrial force so massive it felt unstoppable. Inside the American formation, the first bomber suddenly jerked violently. A flak shell exploded directly beneath its wing. The aircraft rolled sharply. Smoke poured from its engine. The crew tried to hold formation. For a moment, it looked like they might succeed. Then the wing snapped. The bomber spun downward, trailing fire. Parachutes blossomed from the falling aircraft as the crew bailed out into the freezing sky. But the formation never slowed. It couldn't. Behind them, more bombers kept arriving. Hundreds. Then hundreds more. Across Germany that morning, civilians stepped outside their homes and looked upward. Farmers, factory workers, children walking to school. They all saw the same terrifying sight. The sky turning silver. A moving ceiling of American aircraft stretching from horizon to horizon. One witness later wrote, "It looked like the sky itself was made of airplanes." And for the first time in the war, many Germans began asking a quiet question. How could any country possibly build this many bombers? And if America could send this many today, how many would come tomorrow? The answer would soon terrify them even more. Because what Karl Weber and millions of Germans were seeing that morning was not the peak of American air power. Not even close. It was only the beginning. And within months, the skies over Germany would grow even darker with bombers. High above Germany, the formation kept climbing. The bombers leveled off at 27,000 feet, cruising through the thin, bitterly cold air. The frost crept along the edges of cockpit windows. Oxygen masks fogged with every breath. Inside the aluminum fuselages, the crews of the American bombers moved carefully through narrow passageways packed with ammunition, radios, and bomb racks. Lieutenant Robert read. Morgan glanced out the side window again. The sky was still full. Everywhere he looked, bombers. Rows stacked above him. Rows below. Entire squadrons stretching miles behind the formation. From this altitude, the contrails formed white scars across the sky, parallel lines carved through the atmosphere by hundreds of aircraft. Even the most experienced airmen sometimes fell silent when they saw it, because every bomber here represented something extraordinary. Factories, workers, fuel, training, millions of pieces of metal and machinery. And somehow, every one of those pieces had come together in the right place at the right time to form this enormous aerial fleet over Europe. But thousands of miles away, across the Atlantic Ocean, the real story had begun years earlier. January 1942, Seattle, Washington. The United States had been at war for only weeks. Inside the Boeing Plant No. 2, production supervisor Charles Anderson stood on a catwalk overlooking the factory floor. Below him, dozens of unfinished B-17 flying fortresses sat in various stages of construction. Workers moved between them like ants, welding, riveting, installing engines. Even at full speed, the factory could produce only a handful of bombers each week. And it wasn't nearly enough. The United States Army Air Forces had just received its new strategic directive: bomb Germany until its industry collapsed. But that plan required something no nation had ever attempted before: a fleet of thousands of heavy bombers operating simultaneously over enemy territory. The numbers were staggering. Military planners estimated they would need over 10,000 heavy bombers just to sustain the campaign. At that moment, America possessed only a fraction of that number. So Washington made a decision that would transform the war. They would build an industrial machine unlike anything the world had ever seen. Across the United States, entire cities suddenly became aircraft factories. Detroit automobile plants began producing bomber parts. Shipyards started manufacturing aircraft components. Railroads transported aluminum engines and ammunition across the continent in endless convoys. In Willow Run, Michigan, industrialist Henry Ford constructed a factory so massive it seemed almost impossible. The building stretched more than a mile long. Inside, an assembly line for the B-24 Liberator moved continuously, day and night. Ford applied the same principles that had revolutionized automobile production: standardized parts, mass assembly, uninterrupted flow. At full capacity, the factory aimed to produce one bomber every hour. Not every month, not every week, every hour. Many military officers initially thought the idea was absurd. But by 1944, Willow Run alone had produced over 8,600 B-24 bombers. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic in Germany, intelligence reports began arriving on the desks of Luftwaffe commanders. At first they seemed exaggerated, then impossible. American bomber production numbers kept rising. 1,000 aircraft per month. Then 2,000. Soon the United States was producing more aircraft in a single year than Germany had built during the entire war so far. One German officer reportedly stared at the numbers and said quietly, "This cannot be real." But it was. And the proof was now flying over Germany. Back inside the B-17 formation above Schweinfurt, the radio crackled suddenly. A warning from the rear gunners. Fighters 6 o'clock low. Lieutenant Morgan's stomach tightened. He already knew what was coming, because the bombers might have been powerful machines, but they were not invincible. Far below, dark shapes were climbing rapidly toward them. German interceptors. Messerschmitt Bf 109s. Focke-Wulf FW 190s. Dozens of them. Their mission was simple. Break the bomber formation before it reached its target. Morgan glanced down at the gun turrets extending from his aircraft. The B-17 carried 13.50 caliber machine guns. Every bomber in the formation did. When the bombers stayed together, their guns created overlapping fields of fire, turning the formation into a massive airborne fortress. But German pilots had learned ways to attack. High-speed passes, heavy cannon fire, sometimes even rockets. And they were coming fast. Inside the B-17, the intercom exploded with voices. Bandits closing. Tail gunner ready. Ball turret ready. Lieutenant Morgan tightened his grip on the controls. Then he saw them. Dark fighters streaking upward toward the formation. Closing fast. The first German pilot fired from nearly 800 meters away. Bright flashes erupted from the wings of his fighter. 20-millimeter cannon shells tore through the air. The sky suddenly became chaos. Tracers streaked between aircraft. Machine guns thundered. Flak continued bursting all around them. One B-24 in the outer formation took a direct hit. The explosion ripped through its fuselage. Within seconds, the aircraft broke apart in midair. Morgan watched silently. Another bomber gone. And they still hadn't reached the target. Down on the ground, Karl Weber could now see the air battle unfolding high above. German fighters darted between the bomber formations like wolves attacking a herd. Sometimes a bomber fell. Sometimes a fighter spiraled downward trailing smoke. But the bombers kept coming. The formation never broke. More aircraft filled the sky behind the first waves. Wave after wave. It seemed endless. And for the first time since the war began, many German soldiers realized something deeply unsettling. This wasn't just an air raid. It was an industrial invasion, a machine built by an entire nation. And that machine was only growing larger, because somewhere beyond the horizon, even bigger bomber formations were already forming, 27,000 feet above Germany. The sky had turned into a battlefield. Lieutenant Robert Red Morgan saw the first German fighter streak past his formation like a bullet. The aircraft flashed through the defensive guns of the bombers, its cannons blazing. Bright orange tracers ripped across the sky. Morgan heard the metallic hammering of machine guns all around him. Every gunner in the formation was firing now. Inside the B-17, the sound was deafening. 50 caliber machine guns thundered from the nose turret. The top turret spun violently as the gunner tracked a passing fighter. Beneath the aircraft, the ball turret rotated smoothly, its twin guns spitting long streams of fire. For a moment, the sky looked like a storm of sparks. Then, the first German fighter exploded. The pilot had flown too close to the bomber formation. A dozen American machine guns converged on him at once. The Messerschmitt disintegrated in a burst of flame. But more were coming. Far below, the Luftwaffe had launched everything it could. From airfields across Germany, fighter squadrons scrambled into the sky. Major Egon Mayer, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced fighter commanders, had already briefed his pilots on the tactics required to attack American bombers. Because by now German pilots understood something terrifying. The B-17 formations were not easy targets. Each aircraft was heavily armed. Each formation was designed so that every bomber protected the others. A fighter attacking from the wrong angle could be hit by machine guns from 10 different bombers at once. So German pilots had learned to strike fast. Head-on attacks, high-speed passes through the formation, heavy cannon bursts aimed at engines and cockpits. But even with these tactics, the odds were brutal. Inside the formation, Morgan's B-17 shuddered violently. A German FW-190 had just fired a burst of cannon shells directly into the formation. The shells exploded near the wing of a nearby bomber. Morgan watched in horror as the aircraft's engine erupted in flames. For a moment, the bomber tried to stay in formation. The pilot fought the controls desperately, but the aircraft began drifting backward, then downward. The wounded bomber slipped out of the protective gun coverage of the formation, and immediately 3 German fighters dove toward it. Within seconds, the aircraft was engulfed in fire. Another bomber gone. Morgan forced himself to look away. There was nothing he could do. His only job now was to keep flying straight. Across the formation, dozens of similar battles were unfolding. German fighters attacked again and again. Some pilots fired rockets from long range. Others risked flying straight through the defensive fire of the bombers. Occasionally, a bomber exploded. Sometimes a fighter did. The sky filled with falling aircraft. Burning debris drifted downward through the clouds. Yet the formation kept moving forward. Always forward. Because the mission could not stop. Back on the ground, Karl Weber watched the battle with growing disbelief. Through his binoculars, he could see fighters attacking the bombers. He could see explosions in the sky. But the bombers kept coming. Even after several aircraft were destroyed, the formation barely changed. More bombers simply filled the gaps. It was like watching a river. You could throw rocks into it, but the water never stopped flowing. Inside the American bombers, the crews were beginning to realize something else. German fighters were attacking more aggressively than usual. That meant one thing. They were getting closer to the target. Schweinfurt. The factories below produced ball bearings, tiny metal spheres essential for engines, tanks, and aircraft. American planners believed destroying these factories could cripple Germany's entire war industry. But the Germans knew it too, which meant the defenses around Schweinfurt were about to become even more dangerous. Suddenly Morgan heard a new voice over the intercom. The bombardier. Target area in 5 minutes. The crew fell silent. Outside the windows, the flak bursts began growing thicker. Black clouds of smoke filled the sky. German anti-aircraft batteries around Schweinfurt were firing everything they had. Hundreds of shells exploded at bomber altitude. Each one could shred an aircraft instantly. Morgan's bomber lurched as a shockwave rattled the fuselage. Another explosion. Closer this time. Shrapnel pinged against the aluminum skin of the aircraft. A crewman shouted from the rear gun position. "Flak's getting heavy." Morgan didn't respond. He was staring straight ahead, because through the smoke he could now see the target, the city of Schweinfurt, and beyond it, even more flak guns. Waiting. On the ground, air raid sirens screamed across the city. Factory workers ran for shelters. German anti-aircraft crews loaded shells as fast as human hands could move. Above them, the sky was no longer blue. It was black with smoke, and silver with bombers. Hundreds of them. Still coming. Still perfectly organized. Still unstoppable. For the men defending the city, one realization was beginning to settle in. This attack wasn't just large. It was overwhelming. And the worst part? The bombers had finally reached the target. October 14, 1943. Schweinfurt, Germany. The bombers were directly overhead. At 27,000 feet, the formation stabilized, engines droning steadily as the aircraft lined up for the final approach to the target. For the American crews, this was the most dangerous part of the mission, because now they had to fly straight and level. No evasive turns, no sudden climbs, just a steady course toward the factories below, which meant every German gunner knew exactly where they were going. Inside the B-17 Royal Flush, Lieutenant Robert Morgan heard the calm voice of the bombardier. Bomb run starting. The aircraft shifted slightly as the bombardier took control using the Norden bomb sight, a device American commanders believed could drop bombs with incredible precision. Morgan loosened his grip on the controls. Now the bombardier flew the aircraft. All Morgan could do was watch. Outside the cockpit window, black bursts of flak erupted everywhere. The Germans had concentrated their anti-aircraft defenses around Schweinfurt's factories. Dozens of 88mm batteries fired continuously, filling the sky with exploding shells. Each burst sent razor-sharp shrapnel tearing through the air. Morgan felt the bomber shudder again. Then another violent jolt. A shell had exploded close enough to rock the aircraft like a hammer blow. Behind him, a gunner shouted, "Hole in the tail." But the bomber stayed in formation. It had to, because breaking formation meant losing the protection of the group, and that usually meant death. Down on the ground, Carl Weber watched the formation slow slightly as it reached the target area. The bombers seemed almost calm now, steady, perfectly aligned. For a moment the roar of engines faded behind the sound of the flak guns firing upward. Weber looked through his binoculars again, and then he saw something that made his stomach tighten. Tiny dark shapes falling from the bombers. At first only a few, then dozens, then hundreds. The bomb bays had opened. Inside the American bombers, red lights flashed. Bomb racks released their deadly cargo. One after another, 500-pound and 1,000-pound bombs dropped from the aircraft in neat rows. From the air, the bombs looked almost harmless. Small metal cylinders tumbling silently toward the ground. But below them lay factories, rail lines, and entire city blocks. And the bombs were falling fast. The first explosions hit seconds later. A massive fireball erupted in the industrial district of Schweinfurt. Then another, and another. Within moments, the entire factory complex was engulfed in explosions. Buildings collapsed under the force of the blasts. Roofs lifted into the air like sheets of paper. Machinery weighing tons was thrown across factory floors. German workers inside the plants had barely reached their shelters when the bomb struck. The ground shook violently. Windows shattered across the city. Smoke and dust billowed hundreds of meters into the sky. From 27,000 feet, Lieutenant Morgan could see the explosions spreading across the target. Columns of black smoke climbed upward toward the bombers. For a moment he allowed himself to breathe. The bombs had hit. The mission had worked. But the most dangerous part was still ahead, because bombing the target was only half the battle. Now the bombers had to fly all the way back across Germany, and the Luftwaffe was waiting. Above the formation, German fighter squadrons regrouped. Pilots, who had survived the earlier attacks, were climbing again. Fuel was running low, ammunition nearly gone. But they knew the bombers were vulnerable now, because the American fighter escorts, aircraft like the P-47 Thunderbolt, could only accompany the bombers for part of the journey. Deep over Germany, the bombers were often alone, and the Luftwaffe intended to use that advantage. Inside the bomber formation, the intercom crackled again. Bandits returning. Morgan looked behind him. Dark specks were appearing in the distance. German fighters. Dozens of them. They were forming up for another attack. The long journey home had just begun. Far below, Carl Weber watched the bombers begin turning westward. The city behind him was burning. Smoke poured from shattered factories. Fire trucks raced through the streets. Ambulances wailed in the distance. Yet even as the destruction unfolded, Weber couldn't stop staring at the sky. Because the bombers were still there. Hundreds of them, stretching across the horizon. And for the first time, a chilling thought entered his mind. If America could send this many bombers today, how many could they send tomorrow? High above Germany, the bombers turned west. The target was burning behind them, but the mission was far from over. Lieutenant Robert Red Morgan kept his B-17 steady as the formation slowly adjusted course. The aircraft around him shifted carefully, maintaining the tight combat box formation that had kept them alive so far. Below them, Schweinfurt was disappearing beneath a growing cloud of smoke. But ahead, the sky was far from safe. Morgan glanced toward the rear of the formation and saw them. German fighters were returning. The Luftwaffe pilots had been waiting for this moment. During the bomb run, American bombers were protected by their tight formation and focused on the target. But once the bombs were dropped and the formation began turning for home, the structure often loosened slightly. That was when German pilots struck again. From bases across southern Germany, squadrons of Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s were climbing toward the returning bombers. Many of the pilots had already fought one battle that morning. Now they were preparing for another. Fuel was running dangerously low, ammunition nearly gone. But the orders were clear. Stop the bombers. At any cost. Inside the B-17 formation, the gunners were already tracking the incoming fighters. The tail gunner's voice crackled over the intercom. Bandits, 6 o'clock again. Morgan didn't even need to look. He knew exactly what was coming. Moments later, the first German fighter appeared. It streaked through the formation at incredible speed, firing its cannons as it passed. Explosions erupted near the wing of a nearby bomber. Another aircraft fell behind the formation, trailing thick black smoke. The wounded bomber struggled to keep altitude. For a few seconds, it managed to stay with the group. Then the engines failed. The aircraft slipped downward. Once again, German fighters descended on it like wolves. Morgan watched helplessly as the bomber vanished into a fireball far below. Across the formation, similar scenes played out again and again. American gunners fired continuously. The air was filled with tracer rounds. Some fighters were shot down. Others slipped through the defensive fire and struck the bombers at close range. Each attack cost lives. Each attack damaged another aircraft. But still the formation moved westward, always west, toward the safety of England. Inside many bombers, the crews were fighting their own battles. Hydraulic lines had been severed. Engines were failing. Fuel tanks leaked gasoline into the freezing air. Gunners struggled with jammed weapons. Navigators recalculated routes as aircraft drifted apart. Some bombers were so badly damaged they barely remained airborne. Yet they kept flying, because every crew knew the same grim truth. If they landed in Germany, they would become prisoners of war. Back on the ground, Carl Weber and the anti-aircraft crews slowly lowered their weapons. The bombers were disappearing toward the western horizon now. The roar of engines faded into the distance. Only the smoke from the destroyed factories remained. Firefighters battled flames across the city. Civilians emerged cautiously from shelters. Many stared upward long after the bombers had gone, because what they had witnessed that day was something entirely new. A level of air power no one had imagined possible. But the American crews were paying a terrible price for that power. When the surviving bombers finally reached England hours later, the damage became clear. Aircraft limped onto runways with shredded wings and broken engines. Some planes landed with entire sections missing. Others crash-landed because their landing gear no longer worked. Ground crews counted the returning aircraft carefully. Then they counted again, because something was wrong. Too many bombers were missing. The numbers stunned everyone. Out of the 291 bombers that had taken off for the Schweinfurt mission, 60 had been shot down. Hundreds of American airmen were dead. Others had parachuted into Germany and been captured. Entire crews had vanished. It was one of the most costly air battles the United States Army Air Forces had ever fought. Inside the briefing rooms that evening, commanders studied the casualty reports in silence. The strategy of daylight bombing was supposed to work, but missions like this could not continue forever. The losses were simply too high. Something had to change, and within months, it would, because a new aircraft was about to enter the skies over Europe. An aircraft that could fly farther than any fighter before it. An aircraft that would escort the bombers all the way to Berlin. When it arrived, the balance of power in the air would shift forever, and the endless bomber formations over Germany would grow even larger. Winter 1944. Somewhere over western Germany, the warning sirens began again. Across towns and cities throughout the Reich, the familiar wail echoed through the streets. Factory workers dropped their tools. Civilians rushed toward underground shelters. Anti-aircraft crews ran to their guns. And almost instinctively everyone looked up. At first, the sky appeared empty. Just cold blue air and distant clouds. Then the sound arrived. Low, distant. A deep mechanical rumble that seemed to roll across the entire horizon. Within minutes the sound grew louder. So loud that windows began to vibrate inside buildings. German civilians had heard this noise many times before. But now something was different. The sound was bigger. Much bigger. In an anti-aircraft position outside Cologne, a German flak officer raised his binoculars. What he saw made him pause. Contrails. Dozens of them. No, hundreds. Thin white lines stretching across the sky like scratches on glass. And beneath them, bombers. An enormous formation of B-17 flying fortresses and B-24 Liberators advancing toward Germany in tight rows. But this time there was something else. Something new. Something the Germans had feared for months. Flying above the bombers were sleek, long-range fighters with distinctive wings and long noses. P-51 Mustangs. For nearly 2 years, American bombers had fought their way across Germany largely alone. Escort fighters, like the P-47 Thunderbolt, could only accompany them part of the way. Beyond a certain distance, the bombers were vulnerable. That was when the Luftwaffe attacked. And missions like the Schweinfurt raid had shown just how costly those attacks could be. But the arrival of the P-51 changed everything. Powered by the Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the Mustang could fly farther than any fighter before it. It could escort the bombers all the way to Germany and back. For the first time in the war, American bombers were no longer alone over the Reich. High above the bomber formation, Captain James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group scanned the sky from the cockpit of his P-51. The Mustang felt alive beneath him, fast, responsive, powerful. Below him stretched a sight that still amazed even veteran pilots. Hundreds upon hundreds of bombers. More than he could count. They filled the sky in every direction. Some historians would later estimate that by 1944, American and British air forces could launch over 1,000 heavy bombers in a single mission. Entire air fleets crossing Europe at once. And now they had fighter protection. Howard spotted the first German interceptors climbing toward the formation. Messerschmitts. But something was different about their approach. They seemed hesitant, cautious, because they knew the Mustangs were waiting. When the German fighters finally attacked, they didn't charge directly into the bomber formation the way they once had. Now they had to fight through American fighters first. P-51s dove toward them at incredible speed. Dogfights erupted across the sky. Mustangs chased Messerschmitts through clouds and contrails. Machine guns flashed. Aircraft spiraled downward trailing smoke. And for the first time, many Luftwaffe pilots realized something unsettling. The bombers were no longer the easiest targets in the sky. Now they were surrounded by hunters. Down on the ground, civilians watched the enormous formations pass overhead. But by 1944, the reaction was no longer disbelief. It was resignation, because the raids kept coming. Day after day, week after week. Sometimes American bombers arrived in the morning. Then British bombers came at night. Factories were destroyed. Rail lines shattered. Fuel plants burned. Germany's ability to wage war slowly began to crumble under the relentless pressure from the sky. Inside his anti-aircraft position, the German officer lowered his binoculars slowly. He had seen enough. Above him the bombers continued their steady march across the sky, protected by swarms of American fighters. For years Germany had dominated the skies over Europe. Now that dominance was gone. The industrial power of the United States had transformed the air war into something overwhelming, something unstoppable. And everyone defending Germany could feel it, because the bombers would return tomorrow, and the next day, and the next. Each mission larger than the last. Each formation darker and louder than the one before. Until eventually the skies over Germany belonged entirely to the Allies. The war in the air had been decided not just by pilots or aircraft, but by factories, workers, and an industrial machine capable of filling the sky itself with bombers. And when that happened, even the most determined defenders began to understand a painful truth. The war was slowly being lost. Yendi.